first of all say that I want to thank David Begg for the kind invitation to open your annual conference, and Prántas de Rosa for his kind words. Prántas de Rosa and I know each other for a very long time. We shared many ambitions for social justice, and we shared many platforms in making the case for a kind of economics and connection between economics and society, which I believe would have been to the benefit of mankind. I'm also so pleased, and the reason I am here really is to pay tribute to TASC itself as a think tank, an independent think tank for action on social change. TASC has had at heart since its foundation in 2001 the reduction of economic inequality in Ireland, and TASC has also made its mission to foster democratic accountability in our country and to encourage the genuine participation of Irish citizens in the debates and decisions that affect them. And indeed, the challenge of inclusive participatory discourse on economic options is probably now even more acute than when TASC was founded. I've thought long and hard about whether I would try to find time to accept this invitation to speak and what I would say. I'm very conscious that I was a very young student, for example, 50 years ago, when the Freeze report was published, that led eventually to the extension of the Economic Research Institute into the Economic and Social Research Institute. There was hardly a peep from the universities because, of course, the social sciences were very weak at the time. And the issue as to whether and the form of the arm's length relationship between economic policy, research and study should have to government and to the third level and to so forth was scarcely discussed. I think there were 2 submissions. So, if you like, the Economic Research Institute had been founded by Dr. Whittaker a few years earlier, and then this extension to the Economic and Social Research Institute gave a certain tendency to what I would call the ontological lean of the Institute in relation to the assumptions of connection between philosophy, ethics, economics, the social sciences. I haven't time to do that, but another day I would like to tease that out, because one could look at it through the prism, for example, of the work and experience and publications of Professor Damien Hannon, who, after all, was one of the very first professors of economics, of social studies, working through the Institute, later becoming professor at University College Cork, and then going back to the Institute again. I'll open by saying, therefore, I think all of the institutes are in some trouble, all over Europe. I think there's a great disappointment among the citizenry in Europe at, if you like, the absence of a connection, which is what is for them a sense of agonist, a sense of agony, a sense of incomprehension, a sense of distance and of distancing between what is affecting them and to those who have been, after all, in rather privileged positions to analyse, if you like, options, the absence of options, and the very point I've been mentioning, the assumption, which is a very, very serious one in intellectual history, that ontological issues which precede economic, theoretical, and policy issues have simply no place. The price is high. The price paid has been very high. And I'm hoping that today's conference will contribute to invigorating the public conversation that we so pressingly need, not only on Ireland's economic future, but on the cohesive society we want in Ireland, in the European Union, and indeed at global level. And I hope that the discussions strengthen our determination to courageously lay new, solid and just foundations for our collective future. The issue I repeat in relation to where is the practical consequences of the work that might have assisted cohesion. And again, as I'm just back from having participated at the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, and again there in relation to, we had the gift of 2 great decisions of 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also an agreement in relation, at least on the science and the need to act in relation to the consequences of climate change. Missing, of course, was any progress from Addis Ababa in relation to the financing of the response. Missing was any really serious critique of the deficient architectural structure to the international institutions, very evidence of a capacity for reform, an endless flow, if you like, of more of the same, which seemed to be on a slide to a kind of impotent and ineffective scholarship, obviously with very serious policy effects. So I want to thank TASC then and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies for providing a platform on which to grapple with the fundamental question of how we might achieve sustainable models of development for Ireland, models that would deliver decent work for everybody, models that would allow all of our citizens to lead meaningful, fulfilling lives within their communities, and also models that would be hospitable to a respectful use of our natural resources, based on a recognition of both Ireland's international obligations and, of course, our collective responsibility towards future generations. On this question of decent work itself, how big the gap seems to be from that kind of speculation and serious work and the current work, published work in the journals on what is regarded, as you have it on your post, labour market flexibility. And it's something, I want to be provocative again and say, there are a considerable body of scholars to whom this doesn't matter. And they serve well those that they offer that advice. And I think their good fit with each other shows in consequences in terms of the social indicators. A wide-ranging public debate on these fundamental issues cannot be postponed. We have arrived in the second decade of the 21st century at a highly critical juncture when the dominant models of economic growth are everywhere threatening social cohesion, threatening democratic life itself. I spoke about this, which is on my website for anyone to refer to it, in relation to capitalism without democracy, when I spoke at New York University last year, as well as the future itself on our fragile planet. I spoke very early on in my presidency about the consequences of the reduced influence of what I call the mediating institutions between, at that time, if you had identified the debate that was going on varieties of capitalism, forms of capitalism that had adaptive mechanisms, but could it do not, if you allow it, depending on the strength of the mediating institutions and the influence they had in policy. And these were huge factors. So the consequences of inaction are stark. I can't, at this stage, judge as to whether we are to have inaction. I think, should we fail to change our policies, our institutions, and more importantly, our theory of growth, should we fail to tackle decisively current patterns of deregulation, of rocketing and deepening inequality, of cannibalization of the real economy by financialization, then our citizens will continue to pick up the tab, not just in money value, but in the hard currency of their daily existences. I think you have to duplicate that statement of mine as well in any analysis of the new forms of populism which are sweeping through Europe and sweeping through different parts of the world. If that populism is to be a kind of inchoate set of reactions and temporary alliances of grievances, rather than any, if you like, alliance on values, I look at all the European institutes across the European Union and I ask, what alliances have you formed in relation to alliances of values? What have you allowed happen to the concept of social Europe? When did you make a case for integrated scholarship in Europe, appealing to the foundational capacities of the European Union, and so on? Those of us who believed in the European Union and its vision have been very badly left down, I think, by those people who had opportunities, given opportunities, and decided to shirk their tasks, went for strategies of accommodation with what they had tacitly accepted as there was no alternative, even though occasionally they would be forced to suggest that we needed a plurality of scholarship. I participated in their invitations for plurality of scholarship. I felt that many of us who were in favour of pluralism in scholarship and rigour in theoretical work and in integration of philosophy and ethics and economics have been badly served, were treated often with bad faith by those, in fact, perhaps, let's be kind, it was a kind of impotence that they had acquired in a not very rigorous scholarly engagement. The shape of our response should not be determined by any uncritical acceptance of a supposedly intractable state of affairs is obvious in what I have just said. I think that our theory of good, I think that, for example, I think that nobody here distinguished scholars that you honour me by inviting me to come along. There's no question of the invocation of any putative laws, of natural laws of the market. Recently receiving the Ulysses Medal at University College Cork, Dublin, Dr. Axel Honneth, one of Europe's most distinguished critical theorists, delivered a paper on the ethical life of the market, the normative foundations of economic activity. That was the title. That paper, the ethical life of the market, the normative foundations of economic activity. It was a paper far more moderate than somebody like me might give, and far more distinguished. This paper was a model of scholarly inclusiveness, an invitation to draw distinction, for example, between an enabling ethics that accompanies the market and an ethics that restricts the market. It had three. It had an enabling ethics, if you like, that accompanies the market, such as, for example, issues of trust. It had an intrinsic logic of the market itself. The market, wherever historically it has exhibited itself, has gone on basis of contract and trust and so forth. And then finally, of course, the debate about that part of where the market shouldn't stretch, the range of the market itself. I was moved by Professor Honneth's address when it was sent to me, not only for its open invitation to reflection, but also for its important reminder that ethical or normative considerations are not residual or even extrinsic to market modelling. Theorists will know it differed from, for example, from Professor Sandler's work in the United States by saying that it isn't a case of the normative engaging with something different from itself called the market, but arguing that there were in fact antecedent connections to facilitate a market, and that there were assumptions of trust within the logic of the market itself. And then finally, there would be issues of whether or not you should restrain. But therefore, in many ways, that one wasn't talking about anything residual or extrinsic. And that was very, very important work to me. So a basic question, but of course what Honneth's work allows is something that I think it is depending on where is the question to be asked. A basic question for all Democrats is, what kind of society, served by what kind of economy do we want in Ireland, in Europe, and further afield, among our brothers and sisters in poorer countries? I think I'm going to repeat that paragraph because it's the nub of what I want to say. I think that the possibilities of posing that question, the freedom to insist on that question, and the organisation around that question is what is the defining misery intellectually of the worst moments of our present circumstance. And that is, what kind of society, served by what kind of economy, do we want in Ireland, in Europe, and further afield, among our sisters and brothers in poor countries? Do we want an Ireland in which a growing number of our fellow citizens find themselves trapped in chronic job insecurity? Now, you'll have glosses on all of this, and there are very many fine insights in somebody I noticed you hope to have with you, Paul Mason's work in relation to Kondratiev theory informed by technological moments and so forth. But there is a caution to be put in here. I'll just stick to my last in the moment in relation to it and say, what I mean by chronic job insecurity, living bits and pieces, lives, in and out of short-term jobs, without a narrative of occupational development, as it has been put in the precariat, the new dangerous class? Do we want a society in which people's living standards are propped up by access to cheap credit and reliance on asset inflation? That is, until the next financial crisis hits. Do we want a society where so many people suffer from the consequences of negative equity, that contemporary form of debt bondage, and where so many young couples start in life pinned to the ground, their future prospects amputated, unable to move dwellings, unable to expand their family, and freely dream their dreams? Do we want a society where so many families remain on waiting lists for public housing for prolonged periods of time, and where those who cannot afford to buy or rent a home are at risk of being made homeless? Or alternatively, do we want a society committed to promoting decent and dignified standards of human labour? Now I could turn again back to Paul Mason and say, is that what you are telling us? That it is all there for us if we take control over the new information capital, that it will relieve us? And then I got a sense, were we here before? And I go back to his early speeches when I was a young student of Harold Wilson and the white heat of technology. But, of course, everything matters is the political frame into which you put all of this speculation. Yes, a society committed to promoting decent and dignified standards for human labour. That clash is just opening up now, and it's located there in the, if you like, labour market flexibility argument. A society that fosters a rich and holistic understanding of work as a source of personal dignity and freedom. The debate about work itself as human activity, which is interdisciplinary in its sources for intellectual inputs. Family stability, prosperity in the community, democratic flourishing, and solidarity with other workers in Ireland and abroad. Do we want a society where children and the elderly are provided with adequate care and where people with disabilities and their families can get appropriate support? Should we allow the state to be active and extensive in this regard? Should it be made a matter for private provision and competition? Do we want to bequeath to our children in Ireland where everybody will have access to nutritious food, clean water, adequate housing, good health care, childcare and education, irrespective of their ability to pay for those basic social goods? And I haven't even used the word republic, which I've been using so often for so long in our acts of commemoration. These are political economy issues. I use two words, political economy issues. For many people who are practitioners now, they are residual issues. Those are in different parts of the newspaper, social affairs. There are different program makers who do those kind of programs. In fact, actually, they're very far, as it were, from the chosen priesthood who are using the sacred instruments. These are political economy issues for which the discipline of economics has in the past offered different prescriptions. These policy inputs were, I suggest, at their greatest theoretical value when the assumptions on which they were based were declared openly in that journey from the theory of moral sentiments to the wealth of nations, or whatever your attitude on David Hume was, you could debate these issues. And they informed the discourse that elected representatives sought to share with their publics. It wasn't unusual for the people seeking leader offices to which they were being elected to invoke such informed discourse. In what was, I think, in many cases, a powerful democratic texture, the case for fundamental social goods and the respective roles of state institutions and the market in delivering them should never be closed off to public discussion. The thing what I had said was the case for fundamental social goods, that was the old poverty argument we had, see Tony Brown down the back, and the respective roles of state institutions and the market in delivering them. They should never be closed off to public discussion. They are to a great degree. In fact, the right of all citizens to access certain basic social goods is enshrined in a number of international declarations, treaties and covenants to which Ireland is a party. And it revealed an interesting contradiction in our existence as a people. It's as if we are living comfortably with a set of normative expressions which we use for rhetorical purposes, and a set of actions which we in fact actually choose not to criticize, even though they are in fundamental contradiction of that to which we have in fact set our name. And a good example is Article 25.1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the most general expression. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself, that included herself, and of his and her family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. And that article is read out regularly in law faculties and departments across Ireland and across Europe, and kept well separate from their economics departments. These rights were restated and amplified, of course, in a series of international human rights conventions, including the seminal International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966 and ratified by Ireland in 1989. And at the European level then, we have the revised European Social Charter of 1996, to which Ireland is a party. Again, looking for your contradiction, take the report of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, for example, in relation to the impact of austerity on different social groups within Europe. And then you go to the court of the Union itself, and you look at the separate set of decisions and how the two sets of contradictions sit side by side. And then you ask the question, why are European citizens so disaffected at this, in fact, double talk which goes on and riddles the Union? Why? And then, of course, I might say as well, institutions live off this, and frankly, studying this in a way without dealing with it. Why and how have these social human rights imperatives become subsumed by economic imperatives, defined in very narrow fiscal terms in contemporary public discourse? Is there really any space for consideration of such social aims in specialist economic discourse or in professional media commentary? It too often collapses into depicting the case for social and economic and cultural rights as some kind of normative posturing, which it becomes if it isn't linked to policy. A good question then, and why thank you for allowing me to this space. Can we recover then, I ask, the required space, the freedom to craft a new economic discourse, a discourse that would be responsive both to the fundamental needs and aspirations of our citizens and to our global responsibilities in relation to the environment and such defining challenges as extreme hunger, poverty, and mass migration? Does the question of who participates with authority or confidence in the public discourse on the economy, and in what terms, not tell us something of the quality of democracy? Those who know what is good for our soul, that was medieval at times. Do the relationships between government, research institutes, think tanks, universities, civil society, and the media, do they really allow for a plurality of theoretical sources? These questions are fundamental. Just look at what is being published and look at the prefaces about how the stuff came to be published, and you'll get some of the answers. Yes, we have an abundance of sound academic research, pointing, for example, to the harmful consequences of an unaccountable form of financialization of the economy, not just as a motor of inequality, but as a force undermining representative institutions and democratic life itself. Many fine scholars, some of them here today, have made us awake to the way in which deregulatory public policies implemented at international, regional or national level have opened the door to a series of hazardous financial innovations, as they are called, and enabled an alarming shift in the function of banks from lending to the traditional forces of real economic production, for example, to businesses and households, to trading. And those scholars, for which we should be grateful, have shown our credit policies, crucial to economic activity, have been distorted by the emergence of derivatives without substance, of shadow banking that evades any regulation, and how our societies are paying a high price from the diversion of capital from productive to speculative use. I often think as well, in a paper I gave recently, in relation to when, before I became president, dealing with concepts of la impunidad, impunity in relation to human rights in South America. The greatest abuses of impunity at the moment are some multinational corporations. For example, Chartered Oil, against whom there is a finding by the Ecuadorian government of 16.9 billion for compensation, has said, on behalf of their board, we will fight this until hell freezes over, and then we'll find it on the ice. We have an army of lawyers and they're peasants. According to some factors in Ireland, Paul Sweeney, chair of TASC's Economist Network, has, for example, used the OECD data, which he can present better than I, to show that between 1990 and 2009, Ireland had the third largest decline in the labour share of economic growth, from 65.1% of national income in 1990 to just 55.6% in 2009. There's very good work by Sean Byrne and others on, if you like, which is really looking at similar research that has gone through DIT. Your old reference has been made already, and you have had him here. Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. His argument that as long as the return on capital outpaces economic growth, there is bound to be a concentration of wealth amongst a minority. And that now is accepted, and that was presented at your conference two years ago. And I know that I've said you will have, or have had, a fine paper from John Weeks on these questions. So the evidence is all there. But do we have the required atmosphere for an open discussion of policy? What chances of acquiring a space in policy formation or even discourse do proposals for a reform of the global infrastructure of financial capitalism really have? I looked at what was required for the different international publications in relation to implementing climate change or sustainable development. If you take in relation to issues in relation to the humanitarian response at the present time, what is required is 50 billion. What's available is 35. There's 15 billion of a shortfall. What do you do in relation to that 15 billion? Do you try then, in fact, actually to restructure things fundamentally with a new architecture of institutions? Or do you say, we're welcoming the private sector in? And if you do welcome the private sector in, are you imposing the same accountability restrictions on them that you would have had on the state? Or are you free to negotiate an extractive contract in Africa and at the same time then make a philanthropic gesture, which is a small fraction of what you have extracted? These are real and fundamental issues. And when examining current mainstream economic discourse, one must, of course, confront the question of power. I was a young student when it disappeared from consideration, very fundamentally, in the social sciences. You have to look at power and its location. Some issues that arise with respect to the concentration of income and wealth are inescapably political. We know that excessive wealth confers excessive power, and that the concentration of income in a few hands gives the wealthy more power to lobby for policies, including tax policies, that will disproportionately benefit them, much more worse, harm others at the expense of the majority of citizens. So is it not then a healthy, even a necessary exercise to question any engineered consensus congruent with the imperatives of financial power and its mouthpieces? How much has been left, allowed to be, continues to be, will be simply unaccountable? We must ask in relation to current economic research and publication, Who are the empiricists in all of this? I want to make this point very strongly, because sometimes if I give papers like this, I get a certain kind of reaction. The brand of economics currently taught in most university economics departments around the world is being widely challenged for its over-reliance on certain uses of mathematical abstraction, for which claims greater than instrumental value are being made, and for its failure to face the ideological nature of some of its assumptions. Yet it's overly abstract, and there's a reason for that, because sometimes it's not sound mathematics. But I appreciate mathematics and these instruments. But this covert ideological approach continues to be embraced uncritically by many media economic commentators, with sweeping consequences for what are popular conceptions of what constitutes sound economic policy. Sound because it is limited, and sound because the assumptions aren't declared, and sound because there's a confusion of what is an instrument, a theory, and what is a piece of ideological abstraction. And while some of these economic commentators in our mainstream media refuse to question a fundamental old notion of the market knows best, status quo, real empirical work, on the contrary, points to the fallacy of some assumptions as to, for example, Joe Stiglitz did it and got a Nobel Prize, but even people working through it in practical details, the myth of perfect information, the myth of self-balancing tendency of the market, the idea of an automatic extension of the market as beneficial. I think empirical research shows the need to investigate the issue of the remit of the market, the range of what is appropriately included in it, the strength of the assumptions, their transparency, and what should remain excluded from it. I prefer to see the better prospects for a truly emancipatory social economy in a transaction of all these issues. I subscribe to transaction in intellectual theory, in public discourse. But the challenge for us, all of us here today, is to find a way of building, with all our different contributions, an alternative to that hegemonic discourse that casts competitiveness as the ultimate purpose of economic activity, and growth uncritically regarded and defined in output and trade as ends in themselves. We are challenged, in other words, to craft a socially accountable version of the economy, challenged to restore a hierarchy of purpose, where economic objectives, tools, and measures are designed to serve the fundamental objective of human development. These challenges have to be faced in conditions of shrinking outlets for public debate, where the surviving forums exhibit ever more tendency to monopoly, and where the alternative promise of social media is more frequently reactive than informed. We must be able to listen to each other's perspectives, sources, forms of analysis, for example, in discussing the content of growth. My own words on these subjects have sometimes, not that it bothers me, have been distorted. In my speeches on these themes of economics and development, for example, I have never crudely dismissed economic growth. I have rather sought to point to the need to look at the quality and sustainability of economic growth in terms of its environmental, social, and cultural consequences. Increasing national income in an appropriate manner is, of course, necessary and desirable. But such economic growth must always be assessed in the light of its ability to fulfill social objectives. Axel Honneth's point as to the intrinsic normative character of economic method and policy is exactly the point I have in mind here. But of course you have people rising and simply say, isn't it a lot simpler if we say, we have to produce it all first and then let them argue over it? Okay. State that as you view and have the courage to state it publicly. But don't claim that you are in fact honouring any tradition in European philosophy, ethics, or anything else. It is a miserable view of, in fact, social democracy. My view is that the philosophy of sustainable development as a conceptual framework that brings together what does it require? The social, economic, political, cultural, and environmental strands of human activity as human activity, provides a valuable lens through which to assess the soundness of our economic models. It is a framework that also has the merit in that it invites us to substitute long-term strategies for short-term ones and to use qualitative alongside quantitative measures. All of this is good economics, and to espouse a more holistic approach to what constitutes a good economic performance. The sustainable development approach draws our attention, as I've just said, to the long-term consequences of the actions we perform in the present, encouraging us to meet the intergenerational nature of our responsibilities as members of societies that have preceded us and that will outlast us. It helps resolve those contradictions I referred to earlier. The 1987 Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, thus defined, remember, sustainable development as 87 it was, the kind of development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Since the publication of the Brundtland report, so much has been said and written, so much has been suffered about the need to critically examine the precedents given in practically all countries around the world to economic production measured narrowly through either GNP or GDP. That is, through an increase in the level of gross national income. An early warning on the unsustainable nature of our dominant models of economic growth, and one well worthy recalling, had been provided in the early 1970s by the seminal report of the Club of Rome in 1972. The field of development economics has also, for years, produced qualitative indicators that incorporate the non-economic dimensions of human development. More recently, interesting related ideas have been put forward by Jean-Paul Fitoussi, Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, a host of others, in their report for the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. All this body of research, old and new, challenges the contemporary fetishism for a handful of indicators such as GDP or GNP. We know that some activities, while nominally increasing national income, and this is a good place to say that, also entail significant costs to society and our planet, costs for which GNP and GDP fail to account. Examples of environmental costs include, as you know, air, water, soil pollution, the irreversible destruction of animal and plant species, the depletion of non-renewable ones, such as forests and fisheries, which are subject to intense exploitation, and the rate of their disappearance is exceeding the possibility of their regeneration as I speak. And finally, last year's Paris conference on climate change reminded us all how the massive use of fossil fuels by industry, transport, and human consumption is responsible for the emission of alarming levels of those greenhouse gases that are responsible for global warming and its string of destructive consequences in terms of rising sea levels, flooding, soil erosion, and desertification. And the most interesting speech given, short and brief and poignant, in Istanbul was from Nauru. Nauru, where there is no place to go as the sea level rises and they're faced with abandoning their island. And an island onto which the refugee population refused admission to Australia has been planked. Failed refugee policy, failed ecological policy, failed international policy, all on one atoll waiting for destruction. There is now overwhelming scientific consensus as to the reality and consequences of climate change, yet there seem to be few tendencies within mainstream economics or politics towards any radical revision of assumptions in terms of international trade, technology transfer, transport, or resource utilization. The use of indicators and measures that do not account, for example, for the cost incurred by future generations in terms of depletion of resources and degradation of their living conditions continue uninterrupted. Neither in the political science side of it is there any serious analysis of those who spent fortunes opposing the science that was fed into the Paris conference, or those who are active already in relation to different elections in different parts of the world on this issue. We have very valuable statements of evidence, I'm finishing, on climate change, destructive development models, deepening inequality, but little forensic investigation of how it came to be, how money came to be distributed to influence politics and to challenge the science, as I've said, in climate change. The power of vested interests to frustrate and undermine the needs of sustainable development is everywhere to be seen. With extensive impunities, I have said. I gave the example in Ecuador for ecological devastation caused by the actions of multinational corporations who are acquiring far more influence now in the institutional, the international architecture, and little real work on alternative architecture, reform of the United Nations as dead as a dodo. I think, importantly, the sustainable development approach, and in particular a human rights approach. And the good news is there are scholars like yourselves and others working in this area, people like Dr. Drudy and others in Trinity. They invite us to restore social justice, human freedom, dignity, the words that were ringing words when we were talking about Europe positively and in a social sense. That rights-based approach invites us to relocate economic activity in its just place as one pillar of human development. But that has important applications for one of the central questions that you are addressing in today's conference, namely your conception of human work. Is work a means to be an end, a resource amenable to consumption by the market, an aspect of labour market flexibility solely? Too narrow a focus on employment as currently measured, or on the generation of disposable income, can make us oblivious to the ways in which value is created in any given society. Really, should citizens not be enabled to develop their potential through work of their intelligence and hand as human agents formed by sociability, because we do it together, education and talent? And then there are matters of health and education. I think in a way, for example, work unfolds outside of the formal sphere of the market. It is that which brings warmth and meaning in our lives, and our public discourse has become entrapped in a crude form of quantification in that area too. Finally, in relation to care, health and education, although relating to fundamental human capacity and needs, they're often viewed as soft social concerns and posited in an instrumental relation to the primary objective of achieving high rates of economic growth and a good place in global competitors' rankings. The healthiest, most wonderful little place to do and work where no one understands anything. I believe, on the contrary, that such spheres of human activity should be valued for the essential role they play in generating and sustaining social cohesion and human achievement, and then only then for their contribution in the narrower sense. Education is important, first and foremost increasing our citizens' ability to think critically, comprehend the world around them, and they want to do it, make their contribution to literature, and they want to do it, the arts and sciences, because it increases their potential for innovation and for life, as well as, of course, productive work, employment, and income generation. Good housing in the same way, healthcare systems. You think of children before 3 years of age. The program has been written for their inequality. All these rich range of indicators, concepts, and global goals associated with the philosophy of sustainable development encourages us to revisit accepted versions of what constitutes value and prosperity if we are to craft new models of development based on intergenerational justice, dignity for all, and responsibility towards all those with whom we share this fragile planet. It invites us, in other words, to be the artisans in this new century of a historic reconciliation between economics, ethics, and ecology. And it's repeated in the languages of the world in the appeals to respect Tierra Madre. That reconciliation is the foundation stone upon which we might build what I have called in some other speeches a culture of sufficiency, referring beyond a state of survival and mere existence to the possibility of a space in which all of our citizens could flourish and lead fulfilling lives within their communities. And at another level, a culture of sufficiency relates to the floor above which each nation and above all its people must be free to define their own singular path of development and human flourishing in accordance with their culture, their needs and their aspirations. And I believe that our response to the challenge of sustainable economic development then, here in Ireland, here in Europe and beyond, might begin with a social floor, with political choices that are capable of distinguishing between essential social goods and services and other types of goods and services which can be left to the market to trade freely. I think this involves, in some areas, and to an appropriate sustainable degree, a rehabilitation of the role of the state in providing those universal public services that constitute the crucial infrastructure of a social cohesion in any society. Just think of your prospects at the present time if you run a campaign on universality on anything. Such infrastructure plays a huge part in ensuring a decent quality of life for everybody, enabling people, in particular those with lower paid jobs, disability, illness, old age, to access services that would enable them to afford on their own that wouldn't be able to afford them without social solidarity. And we must consider the atmosphere, I finish on this, the atmosphere that currently exists for any discussion of universality, for state provision with standards and guarantees versus weakly regulated provision of services as commodities. We must consider how difficult it is to make the case for collective goals in the context of a dominant and highly individualized form of consciousness, one where the world is experienced by many through highly isolated, privatized settings. Restoring a hierarchy of purpose between economic growth and social objectives. Learning again how to speak another language than that of quantification. These are fundamental imperatives also for our European Union, which is now unequivocally at a point of crisis. We cannot but be extremely concerned at the current normative void defining the discourse on Europe. The concept of citizenship in the European Union can be a unit of consumption or a flexible unit of labour amenable to being transferred from one region of the EU to the other. At the highest level, people look at maps and see blocks of human beings and say, they should be over here. And that is the discourse to which we have come. What has happened to the discourse on the European social model? When did it die? What has happened to the discourse on social cohesion? Did it ever emerge? In many respects, the Barroso Commission's dominant view represented the very antithesis of social Europe. That is why collective discussions, actions, mobilizations matter now more than ever. Without a discourse of solidarity and cohesion, a discourse that is transcendental to aggressive nationalist claims, able to deal with populism, and a narrow understanding of national interests, Europe will, I'm afraid, continue to disintegrate. We need to, as Jacques Delors put it, rekindle the ideal, breathe life and soul into it. That is the essential imperative if we genuinely seek to give shape to the Europe that we so dearly wish for. We have so much work to do to ensure that our European Union comes again to represent in the eyes of its citizens a model of balance between market, society and the environment, rather than a mere vehicle for the extension of free trade. We cannot abandon it to narrow xenophobias and nationalisms either. We have so much work to do to make of Europe, in the eyes of the wider world, a model of solidarity, a shared space of human dignity for Europeans, but also for the persecuted and the displaced who are seeking our help, rather than a space of cynicism where moral aspirations are flung out for rhetorical flourish, while economic realities, as claimed, are asserted to be inevitable and are advanced to contradict both human rights, treaties, aspirations. And I convince myself then to have trust in the capacity for rebirth and renewal of Europeans as they seek to respond to the challenges of our time. My hope is that they will know how to turn again to implement in a meaningful manner those human rights treaties our countries have ratified, that they meant something, and that we will succeed in giving them full expression in our plans, policies and budgets, but also in our public discourse. For that we need a huge change in public consciousness. And as to the bigger picture then, where we are required to implement the agreements signed last year, New York and Paris, those great moments of 2015. Let us recall that the United Nations,
in its Declaration on the Right to Development, adopted in 1986, defined development as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural and political process which aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals on the basis of their active, free and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. That conception of development would ensure that everyone can enjoy what Amartya Sen has called freedoms, including freedoms to enjoy adequate food and nutrition, shelter, sanitation, employment, education, healthcare, equality, peace, security. And we have been at this point of rhetoric before, but now we must deliver an adequate discourse and a consciousness that will deliver some action. And without these and other freedoms, freedoms which are also key human rights, we cannot in Ireland and in Europe and beyond claim to be achieving development in any meaningful sense. Our finding, I suggest, our best mark as intellectuals or scholars. Dear friends, Mila Buikas, may I once again thank TASC-FEPS for organising this conference and for inviting all of you, concerned and committed scholars, trade unionists and activists, to make your contribution to the debate on our collective future. Contributions which we might, I hope, begin to piece together a new public discourse on security and development. Inequality is not our human state, neither is it inevitable. The just redistribution of the fruits of the earth and of human labour is not a dismissible utopian project, nor should it ever be reduced to mere philanthropy, reactions out of guilt. It is a moral obligation for all of us who believe in solidarity, an obligation we must as a society do our best to fulfill. Agus gwym gagra, o'r gain agus o'r goro niw, is the sula gamem with anan on atmosphere new a crohula Kenya. I so wish you well in your work, and I thank you for your patience in listening to me. But I thought long and hard in preparing this speech, which is an unusual one insofar as that I sought to address the circumstances as I find now to be quite urgent in relation to all of these issues. And that makes all of your work and all of your discourse and all of your courage all the more important. And I'm very happy to have been allowed to be part of it this morning. Gurmila Mahaki, thank you.